presentation being cut off a bit. I don't know if everyone else is having the same issue.
Yeah, it looks like it's a little bit on the right side of the screen here.
Yeah, Kate, it might be just that you're sharing from a different size screen or something, that maybe try to shrink it a little bit and see if that helps.
Okay. I didn't change anything, did it?
No, nothing changed yet.
Okay. Not sure. And that's in presenter view, right?
Yeah.
And it cuts off when I do this?
Nope, that's good.
Oh, okay. Same thing as before, but
yeah.
Anyway.
That's technology for you. When in doubt, just like reset it and see if that works. So, okay, so thanks. I'll start off, and then like we said, Kate will continue the presentation. So I did introduce myself, but I just wanted to start out by acknowledging that the land that I'm presenting to you today from has been inhabited by Indigenous people since time immemorial. And as a settler, I'm grateful for the generations of people who have come before me, who have come before my ancestors, who have taken care of this land and cared for it. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today to you from Innisfil, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional land of the Mississauga, the Anishnawbek, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I want to acknowledge the rights of the Indigenous peoples to this land, which is covered by Treaty 18, which is part of the Upper Canada Treaties. So I just wanted to start out with that. As I said, I will go through, I'm going to present to you a little bit on the Species at Risk Act, and then Kate's going to take over and talk about black ash and a few other species. I want to encourage everyone to go ahead and ask questions at any point in time. I don't know if I can see hands up, but you're welcome to just kind of unmute yourself. There aren't too many people on the line, so feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions if you'd like, or we can stop at a few points during the presentation and I'll ask for questions as well. Okay, so Kate, next slide. So why are we here today? So there's a few reasons. We wanted to talk to you a little bit, just provide an overview of the Species at Risk Act in general. Then Kate's going to talk about specifically the proposed addition of black ash to Schedule 1 of SARA, which is what Robert mentioned earlier. And then present on a few other species at risk that occurs near your lands that you might be interested in hearing about. So first, the Species at Risk Act. So the Species at Risk Act is designed to protect individuals and habitat, allow for the recovery of species, and to work in a complementary fashion with provincial legislation. It was designed to foster collaboration by enabling actions by those best suited to act, given the jurisdictional issues within Ontario and Canada in terms of species management and conservation. It allows for a stewardship first approach and requires consultation and cooperation with provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples, as well as other stakeholders. The Species at Risk Act specifically recognizes that the roles of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada and of wildlife management boards established under land claim agreements in the conservation of wildlife in this country are essential, and that the traditional knowledge of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada should be considered in the assessment of which species may be at risk and in developing and implementing recovery measures. So the Species at Risk Act also respects the protection of Aboriginal rights as they are affirmed within the Constitution. So as you'll know, within the Canadian Constitution, Section 35 states that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. And then within the Species at Risk Act, Section 3 states, for greater certainty, nothing in this act shall be construed so as to abrogate or derogate from the protection provided for Aboriginal or treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. So that's listed directly in the Act. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the process of the Act, because there's several different stages that we go through, and at each of these stages, we do consultation activities. So we start out at the assessment side, and this is, you may have heard of COSEWIC, and that stands for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. Can you go to the next slide, Kate? So COSEWIC is an independent group of experts who assess the risk of species extinction in Canada. And they do that using a variety of factors. So, and they really do it as a scientific approach, while also including scientific knowledge, Aboriginal traditional knowledge, as well as community knowledge. And they assess species based on the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is the IUCN. There's a number of quantitative criteria that they use that's laid out by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and they assess all the species against that criteria. And then within COSEWIC, there's subcommittees that are for kind of groups of animals. So there'll be a mammal subcommittee, a reptile subcommittee, insect subcommittee. And then there's also a subcommittee that looks specifically at Aboriginal traditional knowledge. And they provide that to COSEWIC during the assessment process so that it's included within those COSEWIC status reports that are published. When COSEWIC assesses a species, they look at the different levels of risk, and then they'll categorize each species according to that level of risk. So this slide just lays out those different levels. So at the top end, we have extirpated or extinct, which means that the species no longer exists in the wild in Canada or anywhere. Endangered is if they're facing imminent disappearance from Canada. Threatened means that they're likely to become endangered unless the threats are addressed. And special concern means they're likely to become endangered or threatened unless the threats are mitigated. So the next stage in that process, and I should mention that within that assessment process, once the status reports are submitted to Environment and Climate Change Canada, to the minister, we do pre-consultations on the species. So we're looking at consulting, which is the stage that we're at with black ash right now. We're consulting on those COSEWIC assessments that they've done. Can you go to the next slide? So what happens is that the minister receives that assessment of risk, the status report from COSEWIC, and has 90 days to respond by indicating the next steps. We have a consultation period with provinces and territories, Indigenous peoples, and local stakeholders. For species that require a high level of consultation effort, usually if they're really widespread, if they're culturally significant species, we use an extended process. And what that means is that the normal process is usually about 4 months. The extended process can be usually up to 9 months. And so black ash, being a culturally significant species and very widespread, is using that extended process. Now, in this case, because of COVID, it's been extra extended. So the consultations actually started with this one in January of 2020. But obviously then when COVID hit, we weren't able to do a lot of the consultations, and having everything all of a sudden switched to online, it took a little bit of time to get up and running again. And so that's why we're still consulting on black ash at this point. Then once that's done, the Minister of the Environment will send their recommended listings to the Governor and Council, the Cabinet, which then has 9 months to consider whether or not to list a species. Now, there's some implications of the Species at Risk Act, like if the species is listed on the Act, and that depends on also what level of risk it's assessed at. So species that are added to Schedule 1 of SARA, which is the legal list of species at risk in Canada, if they're added as extirpated, endangered, or threatened, then the general prohibitions under the Act apply. And the prohibitions are that no person shall kill, harm, harass, capture, or take an individual, possess, collect, buy, sell, or trade an individual, or damage or destroy the residence of one or more individuals. And for terrestrial species, those prohibitions apply only on federal land. For migratory birds and aquatic species, they apply wherever they're found. And the reason that for terrestrial species it applies on federal land is that that's where the fact that the Act is meant to work in cooperation with provincial and territorial legislation as well. So in Ontario, we have the Endangered Species Act, which applies off of federal lands for terrestrial species. Okay, so the next stage, and maybe I'll stop right there just real quick and see if anybody has any questions so far before I jump into the next stage. Okay, so we'll continue then. So the next stage, once a species is listed, then we move into the recovery planning stage. Next slide. So for extirpated, endangered, and threatened species, the Species at Risk Act indicates that a recovery strategy has to be prepared within 1 year for endangered species and 2 years for threatened and extirpated species. And that recovery strategy must include the identification of critical habitat when possible. For species of special concern, we prepare management plans. And the only real difference between a management plan and a recovery strategy is that there is no critical habitat that's identified. Recovery documents must be prepared in consultation and cooperation with those directly affected. And the purposes of us cooperating with Indigenous communities and organizations on these recovery documents and on recovery planning in general is to gather information to inform the strategies and the plans for recovery, to engage Indigenous peoples in recovery implementation, and to avoid or minimize impact on Aboriginal rights. We really want to make sure that the recovery documents that we're preparing are the best possible ones, and that we've considered all the factors when we're developing these documents. So once we have those recovery documents, then we move into the implementation stage of the Species at Risk Act. So this is where we would undertake the conservation measures described in the plans, and then we look at protecting critical habitat as well. Next slide. So in terms of undertaking some of the conservation measures that we identify within those recovery strategies and management plans, there's several funding opportunities that are available for to do some of that work. And we recognize that Indigenous leadership is key to implementation of the Species at Risk Act. And so to that end, the government has several incentive programs to improve partnership with Indigenous people that support the continued leadership and engagement in nature protection, wildlife management, and sustainable resource practices. So I have just a few of them listed here. There's definitely more, but these are probably the ones that are most applicable to implementing actions within those recovery plans. So there's the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. And then one that's very closely associated with that is the Habitat Stewardship Program. And then there's also the Indigenous Gardens Program, which you've probably heard about recently, just got some more money assigned to that program to continue the pilot program that they ran, I think, the last couple of years for that program. So I'll just talk a little bit about AFSAR because that's probably the one that you're most likely familiar with and is the one that we run through CWS along with the Habitat Stewardship Program. And they're very similar in terms of what they fund, these types of activities. It's just two different pots of funding and you can apply to either one of them. So they support the conservation and recovery of species at risk in their habitats on Indigenous lands and traditionally used territories. It applies to any species that are assessed as endangered, threatened, or special concern by the Species at Risk Act or by COSEWIC. So they don't necessarily have to be listed on Schedule 1 of SARA. It could have been just species that are assessed by COSEWIC, such as black ash, which is not yet on Schedule 1 of SARA. I have the website there, but happy to provide that later. I know it's kind of hard to write that long website down. You can also just Google the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk and you'll be able to find that website. And some of the activities that can be funded through there include the collection and use of Indigenous traditional knowledge, surveys or monitoring of target species, habitat improvement, habitat protection measures, and education and outreach activities. And then the other side of implementation of the Species at Risk Act is also looking at the protection of critical habitat. So once critical habitat has been identified in a recovery strategy, we start looking at what sort of protection tools are available. So on federal lands, the Species at Risk Act prohibits the destruction of the habitat necessary for the survival or recovery of extirpated, endangered, and threatened species. Once critical habitat is identified, the minister must assess whether it's protected from destruction and damage. So the Act provides several different types of tools to provide protection for species and their habitats. So there are some of the regulatory tools, such as protection orders, whether it's Section 80, Section 58, or Section 59. It just depends on the different areas that those would apply to. But they're orders that are put in place by the federal government, usually to protect, like Section 58 orders, protect habitat on federal lands. And then there's protection statements as well. And again, those are fairly similar. They just kind of lay out what existing protection exists for, what protection exists for a species already. Then there's also collaborative tools, which run more towards that stewardship first aspect of the Species at Risk Act. And those are conservation agreements and administrative agreements. So, and that can be any agreement with any government in Canada, organization, or a person to benefit a species at risk or enhance its survival in the wild. And that's a Section 11, or an agreement to administer SARA provisions, and that's a Section 10 agreement. On non-federal lands, so I mentioned before that the general prohibitions occur on federal lands under SARA, where in Ontario, we have the Endangered Species Act, and that's the provincial equivalent of SARA. So that is the act that protects species at risk on non-federal lands, so on provincial lands, on municipal lands, on privately owned lands. The Endangered Species Act has similar prohibitions that protect species at risk and their residences. Instead of doing a critical habitat protection, they have habitat regulations, but it is essentially a very similar mechanism to protect habitat. And so, as I mentioned before, the Species at Risk Act is designed to foster collaboration by enabling actions by those best suited to act, given the shared provincial, territorial, and Indigenous authority for species management and conservation in Canada. Okay, so before I pass it along to Kate, I wanted to stop there and see if there are any questions on the Species at Risk Act. I know that was a very brief introduction, and I ran through that fairly quickly, so I'm happy to clarify anything within there or answer any additional questions that you may have. Okay, I must have done a really good job explaining it.
I have no questions at this time.
Okay, perfect. So I also wanted to, before Kate takes over, mention a project that you will be receiving information on soon. But we are working with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources to try to improve capacity when it comes to consultations under the Species at Risk Act. I mean, capacity in Indigenous communities. So there will be some different pots of funding available through that project, as well as we'll be running some workshops coming up within the next 6 months for this year. And then that project is actually a 2-year project. And there'll be workshops on black ash. There'll be workshops on some other species that we're working on early engagement for. So monarch, wolverine, and potentially some others, as well as, providing opportunities for more one-on-one meetings through that project and more opportunities to learn about the Species at Risk Act and potentially the legislation itself. So we're still working on setting out all of the details of the project, but I just wanted to flag that that's available. And as I mentioned, there will be funding available through that project as well for small scale projects, capacity funding to help communities participate in this whole SARA process. So keep an eye out for that. I think Robert, you'd be on the list to get the information there. And if not, please let me know, but I'm pretty sure we will make sure you're included in that.
Awesome, sounds good.
Okay, so I'll pass it over to Kate. She's going to talk to you about black ash specifically and the proposed addition. and then also some other species at risk. Again, please feel free to ask questions at any time.
Yeah, and again, I can't see anybody else either, so just jump in and interrupt me at any time. It's completely fine. So as Vicky mentioned, just wanted to talk a bit specifically about the proposed addition of black ash to the Act, where it's been assessed by threatened as COSEWIC a few years ago. So firstly, just some physical characteristics of the tree. It's a deciduous hardwood tree. You can see we have a photo of its leaves there. It has opposite compound leaves with 7 to 11 leaflets. It can grow up to 20 meters tall and about 50 centimeters in tree trunk diameter, and it also has flexible wood. Mature trees have gray bark with vertical narrow scaly strips, and the tree can live up to 300 years old and usually starts reproducing at about 30 years old by seed. So we have a little map here on the right-hand side of black ash distribution in North America. So any area in pink there is where the tree can be found. It's found in wetlands such as swamps, floodplains, and fens, usually in sites that are flood prone. It can also occur in moist upland forests as well, but usually at lower densities than those lower lying areas. And as you can see, about 51% of its global range is found in Canada. So there's quite a few threats to the black ash currently. Native ash trees, including black ash itself, are declining primarily due to habitat loss from urbanization and the forestry industry, but also from the introduction of a non-native beetle called the emerald ash borer. Blue ash, for example, is already listed as special concern under the Species at Risk Act, and pumpkin ash is currently being assessed by COSEWIC to potentially be listed under the Act in future as well. So to date, emerald ash borer has caused modest overall declines of ash in eastern Canada. But we are projecting that mortality rates will be greater than 90%. So this is potentially a very devastating invasive species. About 73% of the Canadian population is likely to be affected by emerald ash borer within the next 60 years under current climate conditions. There's a few other threats, just mention quickly. There's been an unknown pathogen recently introduced, well, not recently, in 1958 in Nova Scotia, and still to date, we don't know much about this pathogen, but it has caused major black ash declines out east. There's also cholera dieback, which is a type of Asian fungal disease. It's not yet known in North America, but it is having adverse effects on tree species out in Eurasia currently. And then of course, climate change, which may reduce the suitable range for black ash in the future. So I just wanted to touch on how to identify emerald ash borer infestations. We've got a few photos here that I'll just go over. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Vicky, can you see my cursor? No?
I can.
You can? Okay. Yeah, so this photo here, we can see we have larval galleries. So basically the larvae of the borer are just kind of carving their way through, eating their way through the tree and causing a lot of damage to the interior of the tree, which is obviously quite stressful to the tree. Another characteristic is when the borer emerges, they kind of leave these capital D-shaped exit holes So it's always good to look out for those. And also another sign of infestation is you typically get this crown dieback on the tree itself. So the topmost part of the tree starts to lose a lot of foliage while the lower part of the tree's canopy remains leaved. So it just kind of gradually loses its leaves from the top down, and of course, yellowing foliage. A few other characteristics of infestation. You can get these shoots growing out the base of the tree trunk. They're called epicormic shoots, and they grow when the tree is under stress. And you can also have strange bark deformities and woodpecker feeding holes because they like to feed on the borer. So some management approaches to help maintain healthy black ash populations, but also to manage emerald ash borer. Firstly, of course, we want to promote the best woodlot or forest management practices and overall ecosystem health. Healthier woodlots and more diverse, robust forest stands, obviously increase forest stands' chances of beating stressors like emerald ash borers. So we want to encourage that. It's also useful to continue the identification of high value stands of black ash and the development of forest management plans to monitor, protect, and preserve these stands. So high value stands meaning, mature trees, healthy trees, that sort of thing. And currently, we also have in place restrictions on the movement of firewood that may contain adult emerald ash borers or their larvae. So we have those regulations in place across much of southeastern Canada. And those are regulated by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So here we just have a map of those regulated areas. So anything in yellow might be a little bit hard to see on your screens, but these regulated areas are pretty much broken down to the county level. So for example, Vicky and I kind of live down here in the Toronto area. Vicky's a bit further north than I am, but again, just wanting to discourage the movement of firewood from the GTA, Durham region up to any other area really. But you can imagine bringing firewood from down south here up to say Sault Ste. Marie, and the damage that could be associated with that if you have invasive insects traveling with you and your firewood that you're moving from one place to another. A few more management approaches. So Natural Resource Canada, they have a National Tree Seed Center, which is currently collecting and preserving black ash seeds for future reforestation efforts and breeding purposes, just kind of in case the worst should happen with emerald ash borer spread. They also have an invasive alien species strategy. So they're working on breeding different tree species that are more resistant to certain invasive species. And they also have a biological control program. So in 2016, they began releasing 2 different kinds of parasitic wasps in Southern Ontario that only target emerald ash borer. So these parasitic wasps are native to Asia, just like emerald ash borer is, and the vast amount of studies that have been done to this point, they've only been found to go after emerald ash borer, and they don't cause damage to the actual trees themselves. And they're also non-stinging, so nothing to worry about on our side either. The results of that program are not quite clear yet. It's still in early stages. So, and lastly, there is a a form of pesticide use that can be used to help control emerald ash borer and high value landscape trees. So this is done by trunk injection. But application is costly and it does often require follow-up treatments. So it's not really a great method for the larger scale, for large forest stands. You'd be looking at this type of control, say on your own residential property or in municipal parks and that sort of thing.
I got a question.
Yep.
Is there any, or has there been any studies looking at the impact of the parasitic wasps on native wasp species, or so like maybe they overtake or outcompete other wasp species that are native to an area, or is that not done yet?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, to be honest. But as mentioned, you know, they are only targeting emerald ash borer. So that's actually where they lay their eggs. Mm-hmm. So their larvae grow out of the host, right? But yeah, I'm not sure. I can get back to you on that. My feeling is no, they don't go after our own native wasps or other insects, but I can follow up with you on that.
Okay, yeah, it's just kind of odd to me that, you know, to solve an invasive species problem, you introduce an invasive species potentially.
Yeah, biological control is always a risky form of invasive species management, which is why, at least more recently, you know, we're looking at studying these species in more detail and making sure we really know which species they affect. And yeah. So this is just my last slide on black ash here. As mentioned, we are currently consulting on the proposed addition of black ash to the Act. Formally, there's a link near the end of the presentation that'll take you to the website where you can submit comments on this proposed addition. When you go there, you'll see that formally the comment period closes on September 2nd. That's only about a week away, so we can definitely look at extending that deadline. And as Vicky mentioned, we're looking at potentially having black ash workshops into the fall. So yeah, we're definitely looking at unofficially extending that deadline a little bit. So just keep that in mind. Some of the information we're seeking to inform the proposed listing is, you know, have you seen the black ash before? Is black ash used in your community? How would listing black ash impact you and your community? Are there any costs or benefits that would result with listing? And are there any current or planned activities that would be impacted by listing black ash? So that's some of the main info that we're looking for, but, you know, please don't limit your comments to just those questions there. So I'll just pause there before moving on to the next section to see if there's any other questions. Okay. Again, please just stop me anytime if you do have questions. So as Vicky mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the last time we met with Robert, a few particular species at risk of interest came up in that conversation. So we just want to talk about those a little bit more today. Some of these species we are currently consulting on now. So we'll go through each in turn and kind of let you know where we're at in the recovery planning process, and just provide a bit of background info on the ecology of the species and the threats that they face. So first we'll take a look at bank swallow. eastern meadowlark, and bobolink, which are all types of birds. Bank swallow is listed as threatened under the Act. So the proposed recovery strategy for this species is currently open for public comment on the Species at Risk Registry until September 14th. Again, at the end of the presentation, we have some links there to take you where you need to go to submit those comments. And then eastern meadowlark and bobolink, also listed as threatened under the Act. And their proposed recovery strategies will be published on the SAR registry end of this year, hopefully early next year. Those, deadlines are never definitive, but that's what we're predicting. So there will be an opportunity to comment on those species upcoming. So bank swallow, it's the smallest swallow in Canada. Both males and females look alike. You can see that it has kind of this dark brown upper body. So the tops of its wings, its head, its tail feathers, and the rest of its body are kind of creamy white. It has this large brown band across its breast that distinguishes it from other swallows. So that's a real key characteristic. In terms of habitat needs, it nests in colonies found in vertical or near vertical banks composed of sand or silt deposits, hence its name. And the colonies are generally found along river bluffs, lake shores, coastlines, those types of environments, but they can also nest in human-made habitats as well. They forage over open country and aquatic habitats that support insect populations, and they usually roost in wetlands of cattail or other tall vegetation. Threats to the species, so different types of ecosystem modifications across the species' range that result in lower availability of insect prey. So again, the loss of those open country habitats, that sort of thing. As well as the reduction of prey availability as a result of climate change and widespread pesticide use. Also, the loss of natural nesting sites from erosion control measures or changes in water flow regimes. So instances where we have damming or something like that alter the amount of water flowing through an area, it can really take a toll on those riverside, cliffside environments where they're nesting. Management approaches. So this is what you'll find in the proposed recovery strategies. As it stands, we have listed in there that we want to promote habitat stewardship and compliance to laws and regulations to avoid disturbance of colonies. Implement incentives aimed at landowners for limiting pesticide use. And of course, engaging with the provinces, territories, indigenous communities to encourage nature-based solutions that mitigate shoreline erosion and maintaining nesting habitat, as well as to restore lost or severely degraded wetlands.
Oh, I have a question about the bank swallow.
Yeah.
What would be I guess a human-made habitat? So do you have like an example of what that might be?
We've had cases, say at landscapers, or any sort of aggregate extraction, sort of like mines, that sort of thing. Anything where you have kind of that near vertical surface made of sand or silt. So mines, at landscapers, where they just have mounds of material there. We've had instances reported of bank swallow nesting there.
And yeah, construction sites as well. So, when they're stockpiling material, if they're, excavating something and they stockpile a big pile of dirt, if the angle of the stockpile is at the right angle that barn swallow or bank swallows like, they will nest within those areas as well.
Oh, okay.
So that's why there's always a lot of mitigation when it comes to like construction sites, in terms of you'll see that they're constantly leveling out or changing the slopes on those piles of dirt and other aggregate that they're moving out of areas.
Okay, and what would be like the process or procedure if a bank swallow was found nesting in a construction site where they had improperly stockpiled some material?
Yeah, so bank swallow is also protected under the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So they cannot be disturbed. So individuals and their nests are protected. So if a bank swallow does start nesting at a construction site, essentially they would just have to leave that area until the bank swallow nesting period is over. So that's usually the end of August. So they would have to fence it off and not disturb the bank swallow. So which is why we always promote that mitigation to prevent them from nesting, because once they nest there, then you have to just leave it until they're gone.
Oh, and I see there's a raised hand. Darlene Akerlund has it raised.
Yeah, that's me. So I am an ex-truck driver in the construction field, and many of the pits that I worked out of, they were in the banks. Does anyone monitor this, like to make sure that they're saving these birds? Like does, I don't know, M&R go around to the pits and monitor if the swallows are being protected?
So it would be up to enforcement agencies to do that. So there's the provincial wildlife enforcement. There's also the federal wildlife enforcement.
Oh.
Unfortunately, there aren't that many of them, and so that's always the trouble, is that they can't necessarily be in all places at once. And so
right.
We also go by, like, if somebody will contact also with the province, but if somebody contacts the federal wildlife enforcement and lets us know that they've seen a bank swallow colony at a construction site, then we would work with that company, whoever is working there, to ensure that they are following the rules, so that they're following the Species at Risk Act and the Migratory Bird Convention Act, and making sure that those bank swallows are safe.
So when it comes to construction companies, then I know there's many and it might be difficult to do that, but are they notified about these swallows and that they should be protecting them?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to every construction company to know their responsibilities under the Migratory Bird Convention Act. And I would say that probably most of them do, because they would have run into not just that, but, you know, sometimes you'll have even ground nesting birds that will nest within construction sites, or turtles that will come within construction sites. And so there are other species as well that they have to take into consideration. Even a robin that might nest on, say, a piece of equipment, that's a species that's protected under the Migratory Bird Act as well. So a lot of construction companies are familiar with the rules and regulations around that. And so, especially if there is the chance of any species at risk, they would likely need a permit under either the Endangered Species Act if it's off of federal lands, or the Species at Risk Act if it's on federal lands. And within that permit, there will be mitigation that they have to follow in terms of protecting species at risk within their construction sites.
Very cool. Thank you very much.
So moving now to talk about eastern meadowlark a little bit. This is a medium-sized songbird. It has a patterned brown back and a really distinct bright yellow throat and belly. And it also has this V-shaped pattern across its breast. This species breeds in open grassland habitats, including native prairies, savannas, and alvars. But it will also breed in non-native habitats, such as pastures, idle fields, weedy meadows, young orchards, and even roadsides with tall grass. And we're kind of grouping eastern meadowlark and bobolink together because they share very similar habitat and face a lot of the same threats. So we'll just touch on bobolink a little bit here. It's also a medium-sized songbird. During the breeding season, males are black kind of on the lower half of their body, and you can see they're a bit lighter colored on their back here. And they have this really distinct yellow patch on the back of their head and neck here. Females as well as males outside of breeding season are usually a lighter beige streaked with brown. And you can usually, this species breeds typically from mid-May to late July in Canada. So that's a good time to survey for the species. And just like eastern meadowlark, the bobolink breeds in native grasslands, open farmlands, those types of habitats. So for both species, as mentioned, we see a lot of the same threats, habitat loss like grassland conversion, agricultural intensification, even areas that are just mowed too frequently or are overgrazed by livestock. Problematic species like nest predators, such as foxes, snakes, and birds of prey, as well as non-native predators like cats and dogs will often predate nests as well, and the birds themselves. Climate change, of course, and prey species, insect declines for reasons like pesticide use. Proposed management approaches for the two species, create and restore suitable grassland habitat for the species, obviously, in appropriate landscapes. We want to continue with basic research and status monitoring to improve our understanding of how the species are doing and their population trends. We're looking to develop regionally appropriate best management practices to mitigate high impact threats, since they are quite wide-ranging species. And of course, we're looking to foster cooperative relationships with conservation groups, landowners, farmers, and other stakeholders to mitigate threats to the species and their habitat. So just pausing there again to see if there's any questions or comments on these three bird species. As mentioned, we are currently consulting for all three of them. So we have a few questions listed here just to kind of start the discussion if there are any questions. So again, have you seen the species in your area? Are there any threats to these species in your area that are not identified in the recovery document or what I've presented here? And those sorts of questions. So, any questions? Okay, I'll keep pressing on then. Next, we'll talk a little bit about Blanding's turtle and snapping turtle. Blanding's turtle is listed as threatened under the Act. It was proposed for a status change to endangered by COSEWIC in February of this year. And its final recovery strategy has already been published a few years back on the Species at Risk Registry, so that's there for reference. And snapping turtles listed as special concern. It also has a management plan published on the registry already. So Blanding's turtle, you've probably seen this guy before. It's got a very bright yellow chin and throat. And it has this really smooth, high domed shell. So just the vertical height of the shell itself is quite unique compared to the other turtle species we have native to Ontario. Upper shell is normally dark with tan or yellow spots or lines across it, and the lower shell is normally bright yellow with black spots. Blandings usually lives and hibernates in different types of wetlands, but does use deeper aquatic areas like rivers and ponds and artificial channels even for seasonal movements. And it nests in open areas such as beaches, shorelines, meadows, and road shoulders. In terms of threats, habitat loss again, conversion of suitable aquatic and terrestrial habitat, artificial water level management. So again, you know, messing around with water level and water flow artificially. Dredging as well, so removal of aquatic plants and vegetation and that sort of thing. Accidental mortality caused by vehicle collisions and fishing bycatch. Poaching is also a big issue as it relates to the pet trade. And also invasive species, particularly Phragmites australis. It's kind of a tall growing aquatic plant. I think probably a lot of you have heard of it before, but it grows very densely and it outcompetes native types of Phragmites that we have here. It's the really like tall looking grass with like a little tuft at the top. But this invasive type of Phragmites, it grows very, very densely in wetlands. And so it acts actually as a barrier for movement for a lot of species, including Blanding's turtle. And it really just, yeah, it really outcompetes our native plants here. So it's very problematic for a lot of species at risk. In terms of management approaches, again, continuing to develop mitigation techniques like best management practices and encourage their implementation. We want to encourage collaborative conservation management and the restoration of habitat throughout the species range in Canada, and looking at efforts to reduce mortality, injury, and illegal collection of the species. Snapping turtle, again, very characteristic type of turtle. I think we all know this one, but it is Canada's largest freshwater turtle. The upper shell is brown, black, or olive with 3 ridges that are often covered with algae. Its lower shell is very small and is cross-shaped, leaving the legs and sides of the body exposed. And it has a very large head with hooked jaws, long neck, and tail. It also occupies a wide range of habitats, but it does prefer aquatic habitats with slow-moving water, muddy bottoms, and dense plants. So it's most often found in ponds, shallow bays, slow streams, and rivers and lake edges. But individual turtles can survive in developed areas, such as golf course ponds. Threats to the species, very similar to Blanding's turtle. So again, the loss of aquatic and riparian habitat, artificial water level management practices, dredging, that sort of thing. Accidental mortality from vehicle collisions, fishing bycatch, harvesting of the species, and chemical contamination or pollution of the environment. Again, similar management techniques. So the development of best management practices and encouraging their implementation, collaborative conservation efforts throughout the species range, looking to reduce accidental mortality and injury of the species, and continue with basic research and status monitoring to better understand population trends of this species. So again, I'll just pause there to see if there's any questions broadly about the species and their ecology. I think we only have a few more species to talk about after this.
Oh, sorry, could you just go back to the Blanding's turtle slide?
Yep.
I think maybe the one before that one. Is there one before that one?
No, it's just the two. This one, identifying features and habitat needs, and then threats and management approaches on this one.
Okay. I thought I had a question, but I think I may have put it into the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, so no worries.
Oh, is there questions in the chat? I can't see them. So
there's just some comments on
okay.
In general, like Blanding's turtle have been found in a couple of areas on Atikameksheng's reserve land.
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting, and also to mention one of the things that Atikameksheng does is we put up turtle nesting cages in areas where we've seen more for snapping turtles, and where there are turtles that nest right on the dirt roads. We try to go in and collect the eggs so that they don't get killed by being constantly run over and the road being graded. So we do collect them, and we do have them some within our turtle incubators at the lands office. So and they are hatching. So
yeah,
exciting.
And have you found any Blanding's turtle nests, or do you mainly just come across the snapping turtle ones?
I think mainly come across the snapping turtle ones. We haven't, well, to my knowledge, we haven't actually found a Blanding's turtle nesting, but I do suspect that they do nest in the area, or specifically the one area that we did find it crossing over, and probably somewhere near the community, because they seem to be going in a crossing over through one of the kind of watershed areas. So I suspect there's something nesting happening around.
Another thing you can look out for too is if you ever see them kind of closer in the fall, they might be coming like out of a wetland or moving to other areas where they're overwintering. So those are always good things to take note of as well. So because they do tend to overwinter in those like really shallow areas. So it's useful to kind of keep an eye out for any moving turtles in the fall. It helps you give it a little bit of a hint as to where they're headed to for their overwintering site.
Yeah, they always seem to nest in the highest traffic areas, eh? Or high foot traffic, at least. I have a similar experience this past spring. There was a snapping turtle nesting just by a little pathway that we have at a municipal park here, where tons of people walk through every day, and it's literally nesting like a foot away from the path. So I got a nesting box on that one, and we're feeling okay about things, but it's pretty wild experience, because you could actually, the snapping turtle was it was nesting right there, and everybody was crowding around it, and it's just hard to watch sometimes. Okay, there's no more questions. Just cover a few more species today. Yeah. So lastly, I just want to talk about 3 different types of bat that we have here in Ontario. So little brown meotis, northern meotis, and tricolored bat, which are all listed as endangered under the Act. And we do have a recovery strategy posted for those species. It's one recovery strategy for all 3 of them. And then also want to talk about golden seal a little bit, which is listed as threatened under the Act, and is under consideration for status change to special concern, where if that moves forward, we would be potentially looking at publishing a management plan for the species in the future. But in the interim, there is already a recovery strategy published for the species. Yeah, so golden seal, it's a perennial plant with a single stalk between 20 and 50 centimeters in height with up to 3 leaves. You can see the leaves are kind of maple-like with 1 to 9 rounded lobes. So just a similar shape to maple leaves. They produce a single greenish white flower, which lacks showy petals and is located on the topmost leaf. And it produces inedible raspberry-like fruit with shiny dark brown or black seeds. It's usually found in nutrient-rich deciduous forests in both upland areas and in floodplains. Shading from the forest canopy is important, but can vary to semi-open or closed. And usually the dominant species of tree is sugar maple, where golden seal is found. Threats to species, habitat destruction from the forestry industry, clearing for any sort of urban development or land conversion to agricultural lands, alteration of natural disturbance regimes, so wildfire and flood suppression has been found problematic for the species, as well as harvesting the species for medicinal purposes. And invasive species like garlic mustard and European buckthorn often outcompete golden seal as well. In terms of management approaches, I want to continue to survey and monitor all populations of golden seal and its habitat across Ontario, manage and protect all habitat at existing sites. We're looking to address knowledge gaps related to the species' habitat needs, biology, and conservation, including studies on propagation and potential reintroduction of the plant to areas of its native range where it's no longer found. And as well, the development and delivery of education and stewardship programs to private landowners where the species is found. So that's golden seal. Lastly, we'll just talk about these 3 different kinds of bats. On the left here, we have little brown Myotis, northern Myotis in the middle, and tricolored bat here. So they do kind of all look quite similar at first glance, but there are some characteristic features that can help identify one from the other. So little brown Myotis, it's a small bat, usually 7 to 9 grams in weight, with black ears, black wings, and a black tail membrane, with a wingspan of up to 27 centimeters, so almost a ruler length long. And females are usually slightly larger than males. Northern Myotis is similar in size and coloration to little brown Myotis, but it's distinguishable by its longer ears that usually extend beyond its nose when pressed forward, and it also has a longer tail and larger wing area. Tricolor bat, again, is very similar in size and weight to the other 2 species, but it does have a distinct coloration. So it's usually a reddish brown or yellowish brown color. Its ears and face are brown. Its forearms are usually orange, red, or pinkish. And again, it has darker colored wings and flight membranes. In terms of habitat needs for all 3 species, generally, you have overwintering habitat, summering habitat, and swarming habitat. So overwintering habitat includes any type of hibernacula, such as caves, abandoned mines, and wells used for hibernation or for winter survival. Summering habitat includes maternity roosts and foraging habitat within commuting range of those roosts. Swarming habitat is used in the late summer and early fall for mating and socializing, and they're often typically used as hibernacula later on into the year. Threats to species, energy production and mining that may disturb hibernacula, also wind farms, potential collisions associated with wind power, invasive and other problematic species and diseases. So a big one for native bat species in Ontario is a fungal disease called white nose syndrome. So basically, if the bats catch or are exposed to this fungus, they start to grow it on their face, which is really itchy for them, and it disturbs them during hibernation. So they're awake when they're supposed to be hibernating and expending energy when they're not supposed to be. So, you know, it causes them to wake up and they need food in the middle of the winter, and there's not as much food available, of course, in the winter as they need. So, so yeah, white nose syndrome's a big one. And then pollution and climate change, of course, as well. Management approaches need to implement a standardized survey protocol for these three species and their habitats. A good one is the North American Bat Monitoring Program. Continue to surveil for white nose syndrome and continue on with the mitigation programs that are already in place. We want to continue to identify baseline population trends, again, to understand better how these species are doing. And we want to look at the development and delivery of outreach programs that discuss the importance of maintaining hibernacula and maternity roosts and bats overall to people, the ecosystem, biodiversity, and the economy, and conserve and enhance habitat of the species and their prey. So again, I'll just pause there. Only a few more slides to go in the presentation. If there's any questions about the bats or golden seal, we know. Otherwise, I'll move on.
I had a question mainly for the participants or for our community members. Do any of you know of anybody that have harvested golden seal previously? Just wondering. I'm not. I haven't really seen that plant in their area very much, so I was just curious.
Yeah. It only occurs in a kind of has a smaller range in Ontario, so might not be an issue in some areas. But.
Okay, and then one thing I can mention is that so at Atikameksheng we've been carrying out a bat study for the past couple of years. And we've been putting up doing like acoustic monitoring, it's called, as well as some general desktop studies to identify some of the habitat that they may be using. And I think in the bat study, we've for sure seen little brown myotis in our acoustic studies. And as a little kid, I remember seeing I don't know if it was little brown myotis or northern myotis, but one of those two bats for sure. I've seen them at like our first beach, we call it, and in one of my neighbor's backyard, kind of using their kids' play set. It was on the roof. So I've seen those around before. And then I think we even one summer we were lending out their, I guess like their acoustic devices that you could connect to your phone. I guess they're little apps you can use. But I'm not exactly sure how much we did that or how much participation we got. But I thought that would be, for sure a cool thing to do if you're out on the land and we're interested in doing that. I think we do still have those devices, and we can still maybe provide that to community members who are interested in, if they want to go out and look around and spend some time on the land and some more quiet, I guess you need to be. So that was a project that we had, and I think we're going to be continuing it for the next couple of years too. So look out for some updates for community members.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. That's that's the best way to survey for bats is using acoustic recording type units. As you can imagine, they are quite hard to identify, just looking up at the night sky, right? They fly around so fast, so it's pretty much impossible to do things that way. So we use the acoustic recording units to record kind of the sound wave or pattern. You can analyze it on computer software after you've recorded the audio to see what particular pattern it makes. And in that way, you can distinguish one species from the other. And that's, the noises they make from actually echolocation, right? So yeah, very interesting work.
The other thing you can do is keep an eye out to see if there are any bats that might occur in buildings in the community. A lot of times old buildings, they have little gaps that can allow bats, and they can get into very small gaps that will allow bats access to attics or even like in barns or anything like that. The two most common species you're going to encounter living in houses are typically little brown myotis and northern myotis. Little brown myotis and big brown myotis. So those are the two most common ones that you're likely to see. So it is helpful though to use those acoustic recorders to try to distinguish between the species. If you see them coming out, you can count them and listen to their frequencies and see which species it is. So did you get to do any captures of bats this year, Robert?
No, from my understanding, I guess we were told by the ministry that we were, I guess with the COVID happening, that they wanted to try to limit the handling of bats because they were still unsure of the connection with, COVID and bats and potential exposure to our native bats to this virus, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
So we're told to hold back, but we did do it a couple of years ago. We did have a bat capture night, and community members were invited to come out. I think we had some participation. There was probably, I think, 4 or 5 community members that came out. And we had Derek Morningstar. He's a consultant that we work with on this project from time to time, and he helped with that. I guess it was pretty good. I wasn't able to go. I wasn't around for that at that time.
That sounds like it's not for the faint of heart.
If anybody does get a chance to do that, it is really great to see those bats up close and personal. So if Derek does have those bat capture nights in the future where you get a chance to observe him, I would highly recommend it. It is really interesting.
And Robert, how is that actually done? How do you actually capture the bat?
From my understanding, they would set up a net of some sort, kind of similar to what you would do for birds. So they would fly into the net, it would kind of stop them and catch them, and then you would carefully take them out. The net wouldn't hurt the bats, and you just got to be careful to handle them. I think one of the precautions was that if you're going to be handling them, you needed to have a rabies shot or vaccine, in case you got bit by it. So
the bats aren't really happy to be pulled out of the net and it's entangled, so bites are very possible.
I remember when I was young, when I was a little kid, there was one flying by. I was trying to catch it with like a smelt net, and luckily I didn't, and didn't have to potentially handle it and maybe get bit by it.
Alrighty, I think we got 2 or 3 more slides here. And so we just wanted to include and end off on some actions that you can take to help species at risk, kind of on an individual level. First of all, we just want to plug the Species at Risk Public Registry. So we've been talking about this website a lot throughout both Vicki and I's portion of the presentation, but really is a great resource to learn more about Canadian species at risk, especially the ones that we've discussed today, and learn more about their threats and habitat needs in more detail. Of course, we'd encourage that voluntary stewardship activities are practiced, as well as best management practices, and that we're all avoiding activities that can harm species and their habitat. One of the best things you can do is report species observations when you do see wildlife, whether that's birds or plants or whatever you encounter day to day. There's 2 really great free apps here. eBird is one of them. So we have the website plugged here, but there's also a mobile app for your phone. So this is for birding observations mainly, but you can take photos of birds, you can record little audio segments of their calls and upload them to this app, record where they're found, and get help in identifying those species when you're not sure what exactly they are. iNaturalist is very similar. There's also a mobile app available for that platform as well. You can record any species you want on there, including birds. Again, recording those observations using photos or audio segments. We also have listed here the Ontario Natural Heritage Information Centre. So this is really the hub for all species at risk occurrence information for the province. So it's the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. It runs this Natural Heritage Information Center. They're responsible for it. And they often pull observations that have been verified off of these 2 platforms, eBird and iNaturalist. So if you're contributing on those platforms, there's a good chance that they could be pulling it into their data set at the Natural Heritage Information Center, and we use in developing the recovery documents that we've been talking about today. We use that information all the time. You can also take a look at the Canadian Wildlife Federation and Birds Canada websites to learn more about migratory bird conservation. And you can take part in activities that promote conservation of species and their habitat at home, such as preventing bird window collisions by adding screens or markers to the outside surface of your windows. You can build a bird-friendly garden. So we always encourage that you're planting a wide variety of native trees, shrubs, and plants that produce seeds, nuts, and fruit, and promote insect biodiversity, as well as gardening with native plants. We have a couple websites here that can help you out with locating native plants that are in fact native to your local area and not just more broadly to the province. And of course, we encourage as well the management of invasive plants on your property where they're found. There's a few really great landowner guides on these websites here as well. So we'll leave it at that. Again, the Species at Risk Public Registry website is linked here, and you can click on the Consultations tab to see what documents we are currently consulting on at present. If you want to comment on the proposed addition of black ash to the Species at Risk Act, you can follow this second link here. And you can provide your comments there as well as for any other species proposed for listing back in January 2020. And, you know, feel free to reach out to either Vicky or myself at any time. It's usually best to grab us on email and let us know if you have any questions following this presentation. And, you know, again, thank you all for attending today.
Thanks everyone, and I'll just add that if you want to submit comments too, you're welcome to just email them to me. They don't have to be in any sort of form. Just feel free to email me anything that you'd like to say about any of those species or want to submit comments on any of those open consultations that we mentioned.
All right. Oh.
I was just going to say, Robert has a copy of this slideshow. So if you want a copy of that as well, that's readily available. It's a lot of links throughout the presentation, so.
All right, well, miigwech for the presentation. I'm going to stop recording now. And then if there's any other questions, we'll maybe just ask them there.